Welcome to these 6 watercolour flower landscape tutorials for beginners. They're packed full of techniques and step-by-step in-depth guidance to enable you as beginners to get started and build confidence in your watercolour painting. So, shall we get started? For my first tutorial, I'm going to be painting Thistles in the Meadow watercolour step-by-step tutorial. This is for those of you that need structure in your watercolour painting. Step 1 of the 6 steps is planning your painting, the composition, using thumbnail sketches, choosing the colours that you want to use, the materials, the techniques, etc. So spending time in the planning process. And for those of you on my Patreon membership, I will be demonstrating a tonal chart, talking about the colours that you can use, warm and cool, and the different techniques, along with a longer, more in-depth tutorial with the downloadable sketch available. Details about that can be found in the description below. I'm using 2 sets of primary colours, a cool Prussian blue and a warm ultramarine blue, and it's just to get me a variety of different greens and maybe some violets as well. I am using a cool yellow, lemon yellow, and I'm using a warm yellow, Quinacridone gold. I'm using a cool red, which is opera rose. You could use permanent rose, and I'm using cadmium red for the warm red. So once you've finished planning your painting, next step is to draw your painting. I use an HB pencil and mask out, if necessary, any light areas. So I've mixed up my colours for the background trees, and I've used a cool blue and the cool yellow, mostly the Prussian blue with a touch of the lemon yellow. And I'm working wet in wet with my size 10 brush, leaving white and light areas as well. So still thinking about those lights. Now in the photograph, you'll notice that the background is very dark, and sometimes photographs can lure you in to sort of make you paint something very dark. I've decided to make it lighter and cooler using cooler colours and lots of blue, so that it's paler and cooler, so it recedes and creates depth. I've mixed up a little bit more of Prussian blue here with a touch of the lemon yellow. I've also used a little bit of ultramarine as well in the background. Not that it's a cool blue, but blue is a cool colour anyway, so it recedes. Everything's cool in tone. Warm colours come forward, they're hot and fiery. Cool colours recede. So this is all wet in wet, and I'm using my plastic card to scratch into the surface of the paper. It almost makes a dark line because the paint runs into the scratch to create some very small thin branches, the illusion of them, because I can't really see it in the photo. I'm using a very, very creamy yellow with a mixture of the lemon yellow and the Quinacridone gold, painting damp into wet. And I'm actually tilting to make sure that that greeny or the bluey green colour doesn't run down into my lighter sort of middle distance area. So I've mixed up a little bit of ultramarine and lemon yellow. So it's a cool yellow. Cool yellows make beautiful greens, as do cool blues. Ultramarine is a warm blue, so it's got tiny particles of red in it. So it warms up the colour, so it kind of neutralises it a little bit. But it's still a good colour to mix greens. So I've mixed up a very creamy green in the foreground here, using a bit of Prussian blue along with the lemon yellow. So really just mixing up the greens here. But I want them, as you can see, the difference between the background now at the middle ground and the foreground is these greens are a lot warmer and the ones in the background are a lot cooler. And I'm actually sprinkling on a little bit of salt here just to sort of create some lovely light textures when the painting starts to dry. So let that dry naturally. I'm also using light brown Brusho just to put on around the sort of thistles here to create some textures. I'm going to let all that dry naturally. For step 4, I've allowed the painting to dry and I've removed the masking fluid. I'm going to paint light and mid-tone washes and then allow the painting to dry once more. So light and mid-tone washes. So I'm using opera rose with my size 6 brush. I've wet each thistle. I put on a very pale wash to begin with, bearing in mind leaving the top part of the thistle light, almost white of the paper, a light and then a mid-tone just underneath there. And I'm painting this sort of the dark, well, the mid-tone wash more damp into wet, the first one wet into wet. Just takes a bit of control. If you find the wash is running up to the top of the thistles, just put your watercolour painting at a tilt to make sure it runs down towards you. And you can see there's a good example of me painting it there, light at the top in that centre thistle there, and mid-tones towards the bottom using this size 6 brush. What I'm doing now is I'm actually mixing some of the cadmium red with the opera rose, and I'm just painting this at the bottom. So this is more of your mid-tone. It's slightly creamier, so it's damp into wet or damp into damp, depending on what's happening with thistles. The other thing I would like to share with you is try not to paint all the thistles all at the same time. Sort of concentrate on a little cluster. You'll have a lot more control that way. I'm now sort of painting some of the foliage here as well with a Quinacridone gold and a touch of the Prussian blue. You can also use the lemon yellow and the Prussian blue. They make some nice greens, but it's more of a golden colour here with a touch of green. So I'm just working the paint in there. So the light washes first and then the mid-tone. So it's a really good way when you're planning, you can just think, so I'm working with light washes, now I'm working with mid-tone. So it keeps you sort of in the present really and not worrying too much about what's to come. So I'm just painting underneath the foliage here, again working with light tones, even though I could have masked this out actually to make it a bit lighter, but I'm just going with it. So it's with Quinacridone gold with a touch of ultramarine, so light tones and mid-tones, pretty much working wet on dry and then putting the mid-tones in damp into damp using my size 6 brush. If you find that's a bit too big, swap to a smaller brush. So I've allowed my painting to dry and now I'm working with the mid to dark tones, and I'm just sort of, the thing to decide as well is where your light's coming from. So I've decided obviously it's coming from above, but the sort of the light's also coming a little bit from the right hand side. So I'm concentrating on putting my darker tones on the left hand side. I'm working wet on dry using my size 2 round brush just to paint in these very thin stems. Take your time with them, they can be a bit tricky. And I'm just using a mixture of the ultramarine with a little bit of the lemon yellow, and it's a mid to dark tone here because the stems do come forward a little bit more from that lighter background, so I really want to sort of bring them out to create depth in my painting. This is the beauty of working light to dark. You create three-dimensional, or the illusion of a three-dimensional space on a 2D surface. I just love it. I'm painting in some mid-tone to darker tone leaves here, and I like to mix up my greens, so I might add a little bit of Quinacridone gold, a touch of lemon yellow, and also change the blues as well, just to create some variety of colour. I'm just painting some mid-tone and dark tones just above here in the foliage using my size 4 brush, using a mixture of the ultramarine and the Quinacridone gold. I've allowed my painting to dry and it is my final stage. It's step 6, and I always like to call this darks and details, but I do sometimes finish off with a light spatter as well. But I'm just painting with my size 4 brush here, or you can use a smaller brush, whatever makes you feel comfortable. I'm just painting in some darks on the stems on the left hand side and just painting quite flat dark leaves here and then. They're quite silhouetted, and I'm sort of pressing down with my brush and then lifting off, so you get the sort of more pointy end of the leaf there. And I'm using ultramarine and Quinacridone gold. And I am now painting, stippling really, some very dark, I've mixed up some Prussian blue and red, which makes a really lovely dark brown, warm red and a cool blue. And I'm just stippling on the left hand side here, some darker marks, darks and details. Keep that structure so you will have more successful paintings. The one thing you will get out of this is you won't be overpainting. You can see that structure and you're working light to dark, and you'll find you're disciplining yourself more. And the more you get to grips with this, the more relaxed you'll be, and you'll develop your own style. And sometimes, you know, you'll break some of those rules as well, so it doesn't matter, but it's just to get you there. So I'm just putting a few lighter bits in there just to soften some, and I've given a little little spatter with some Quinacridone gold and a little bit of the lemon yellow mixed up as well, just to finish off, a little bit of sparkle, and it stops me from overworking my painting as well. I felt there was too much difference between the green grass in the background and the stems and foliage and thistles in the foreground, so I'm just using a kind of a watered down mid-tone wash of Quinacridone Gold with my thin brush just to kind of fill in a little bit more. And I'm actually using some white gouache mixed with the Opera Rose, and I'm just painting a few lights on the top of the thistles as well and spattering that colour. And it just creates a nice, you know, that sort of pinky shade here and there just to finish off my painting. So I've removed the tape and it reveals a really nice white border, and you can assess to see if you need to do any more. One thing I didn't point out earlier is I love what happened to the salt. It's lovely, it's magical. I'm actually really pleased with this, and I really hope it's given you some sort of structure and idea of how to progress in your watercolour painting. And we're going to use similar techniques in this next tutorial. I'm going to be painting a step-by-step tutorial of some cosmos flowers in a lovely misty atmospheric landscape, using a Pebeo masking pen to actually kind of almost paint and draw these flowers. If you like, you could actually draw the flowers in first and then fill them in with masking fluid, but I've actually gone for it and I'm just painting and drawing them in with this pen. So I'm mixing up my background colours. I'm using a size 4 round brush, and I'm using just 3 primary colours here: Cadmium Yellow Pale, Ultramarine and Opera Rose. So for my first wash, I'm mixing up a little bit of ultramarine, a touch of yellow and a touch of pink, and it's quite watery consistency. I'm making a little puddle of that. That's my first wash. So for my second wash, I am mixing up some ultramarine with a touch of yellow to make a bluey green, and then I'm using my pipette to make the wash quite watery. So I'm mixing up plenty of sort of different shades of green to this grass area here, using the ultramarine with the touch of yellow just to make a sort of a dark bluey green. It's quite nice as well to add a tiny touch of pink, so it kind of neutralizes it a bit and makes it look less scarish. Now what I'm doing now is I'm wetting the paper with clean water with a large brush. It's part of the Black Velvet series by Silver Brush, size 14. So now I'm going to paint the sky area first, just putting on a very pale wash. So now I'm putting on a lovely light green wash in the middle distance and a slightly darker greener wash. These are very watery paints, so don't worry, it's all going to be for the distance. So obviously it really brings out our cosmos flowers, but we've got this lovely atmospheric background. So I'm putting on this more of a bluey greeny wash. And this wash now is slightly creamier, slightly thicker, with the yellow and the blue, just to kind of bring out the foreground a little bit more. And now I'm painting in these distant trees with the ultramarine with a touch of yellow. This is sort of more damp into damp with this size 4 brush, and I just want to create sort of fuzzy distant trees to create a lovely atmospheric effect and also to be a lovely backdrop to my cosmos flowers. So now I'm using this size 4 brush and I'm just painting some furrows in the grasses just to create a little bit more of a distant sort of effect, using some diagonal perspective lines so it leads your eye into the centre of the painting. The paint's slightly thicker, it's more creamy, it's damp into damp, so the paint doesn't bleed too much, but you can still get these lovely soft edges. I actually use slightly darker, thicker paint here just to create some darker washes in the foreground, so it really creates some depth in your painting. I'm still using this size 4 brush to create some marks and grasses in the foreground. And now this paint's quite thick and creamy, and it's still damp, the paper, but it kind of gives me some soft edges still, but it doesn't bleed too much. If you find your painting is drying very quickly, just give it a very fine mist spray with a spritzer bottle and it will give you a little bit more time. I'm actually using a plastic store card now cut up, and I'm scraping off some paint to create some lighter grasses, but also to create some stems and leaves, and it's such an exciting thing to do. My painting has dried now. I'm going to take the masking fluid off, with some masking tape or framing tape, and it takes it off. You want the framing tape to be flat to the paper and then rub off. You can use a rubber and you can also use your thumb. Once all the masking fluid is taken off, I'm actually now mixing up a little bit of yellow and pink, and I'm painting in the centre of each of the flowers, wet on dry with a size 4 round brush. I'm using some of the ultramarine and the yellow, and I'm painting in some of the stems now, again with the size 4 round brush. It's got a lovely point, this brush. It's fun to use. And you can see I can paint very, very, very thin stems. I'm also painting some little bits of details on the buds as well. So you need a steady hand for this, but if you're worried about it, you can always use the twig. I always love using my twig as well, but just use something that you feel comfortable to use. So I'm mixing up a little puddle of the opera rose with a tiny touch of yellow, and I'm painting the petals now with my size 4 brush, wet on dry, just painting petal by petal and varying the colours as I go. I've added a touch more yellow to this wash here just to make the colour a little bit deeper. It's lovely mixing pinks and yellows together because you do get some lovely different sort of shades. Here I'm actually using the pink on its own. It's just the opera rose on its own, very diluted to get some beautiful pale washes, and then I've added a slightly darker wash. So you can really, really vary these colours. So have fun painting these beautiful pink flowers. That's the first washes on the flowers nearly complete. What I'm using now is a mapping pen, and I'm actually drawing all the very thin sort of little leaves on these beautiful cosmos flowers. If you don't have a mapping pen, that's fine. You can use a twig or you can use a very thin brush. I'm now using the size 4 round brush, which is an ideal brush for doing that as well, and just painting some shadows in the centres of the flowers. And I've used all 3 colours mixed together for that. Just putting a few darker marks to represent the little divisions of petals, and I'm just using the pink with a touch of blue and a touch of yellow to give that sort of shadowy colour, and just putting little marks here and there, give the impression of shadows and details on the flowers. I'm just going to lift off a little bit of colour off the centre of the flowers to create a little bit of light on top, and then I'm lifting it off with the kitchen towel to really lift off the paint to reveal a lighter area on top of the flower. What I'm doing now is I'm just finishing off with a few little bits of details on the edges and shadows on the petals, just to create a little bit more detail, just here and there, wet on dry, and then softening with a damp brush, just to really bring these cosmos flowers to life. I always like to finish off my paintings with darks and details. I try to keep this to a minimum. I don't want to overwork things, so I'll just put little bits here and there. I like to finish off with a spatter, so I'm going to actually cover the background with some kitchen towel now so I don't get any spattering on my sky, and I'm spattering some of the colours in my palette, some pinks, some greens and some darks, just to give that extra little bit of texture to finish off my painting. So I'm just taking off my masking tape now to reveal this gorgeous white border. I really do like it. It helps me just to finish off a few little details here and there, not to overwork this painting. And I think I'll leave it there for now. I really hope you've learned something from it, just by painting those lovely atmospheric washes in the background, wet in wet, and then painting these lovely cosmos in the foreground and using that little mapping pen to create all those very thin leaves, and doing all this using just 3 colours. For my third tutorial, I'm painting these pretty poppies in a gorgeous sort of cornfield with distant trees. Sketch the outline of this painting with an HB pencil, and I've also masked out the poppies as well with some masking fluid. I'm using Cerulean here, painting it wet and wet for the sky, and I've mixed up a little bit of Cerulean and Cadmium Red, painting the sort of distant trees or hills here, sort of wet into wet, trying to keep it away from bleeding in the sky. As you see, I'm tilting to stop that happening. I'm painting the sort of distant middle ground and foreground with a mixture of permanent yellow and a little bit of Quinacridone gold with my size 10 brush, wet into wet. I've allowed the painting to dry, but I've actually wet all those distant hills again. I've mixed up a little bit of blue and yellow using my size 6 brush, painting damp into damp. The paint is quite creamy here. I've mixed up ultramarine with Quinacridone gold, painting this damp into damp inside that sort of green wash that I had originally painted there to create some lovely darks. I've added some violet as well, and now I'm adding some crimson, because if you look at the photograph, you can almost see sort of red coming out from there. That's why I love the photograph so much. This is permanent yellow. I'm painting wet on dry now, and it's just really these sort of distant fields here. It's got a lovely yellow sort of colour coming from it there. So the paint is quite creamy, and I'm using my large round brush here, painting wet on dry, adding a little bit of the Quinacridone gold here, damp into damp, so you don't want the paint too wet. I'm just working my way down to the foreground. As you saw there, I'm adding a little bit of blue and yellow, quite creamy, painting damp into damp in the foreground here. So I've actually got a little bit more green in my paint now. And if you want to make the colours darker, just add a little bit more of ultramarine. Ultramarine and Quinacridone gold make a beautiful dark. I'm using the end of a tube of paint to scratch into the surface of the paper to create thin, dark lines, because the dark paint runs into those scratches. This is permanent, so if you're not sure about it, you can paint these thin lines later, wet on dry. I've removed the masking fluid. Make sure your painting is dry before you do it, because it can tear a hole in your paper by doing that. So I'm actually now painting the poppies using some cadmium red, quite watered down, working wet on dry with my size 6 brush, and then I'll drop a little bit of red and yellow mixed together to give a lovely warm orange colour in these poppies, and add creamier, darker paint by mixing the cadmium red with a little bit of alizarin crimson. Actually using a cocktail stick here to scratch into the surface of this damp paint to create more thin, dark lines. Remember, this is permanent, but it does create some nice texture on the poppies. I'm painting the seed heads now and the buds and the stems using my size 4 round brush with a mixture of the Ultramarine, Quinacridone Gold and Cerulean and yellow. So getting some light limey greens and some lovely earthy greens as well. I'm painting some of these pretty violet flowers here using a mixture of ultramarine with a touch of alizarin crimson, working wet on dry and then dropping in some water to dilute to create some light at the top using my size 4 round brush. So I've allowed my painting to dry and I'm working on the poppies again, building up some of the shadows and details using a mixture of cadmium red and alizarin crimson, softening with some clean water as I go. I'm painting the dark at the bottom of the poppies here with a mixture of the ultramarine, alizarin crimson and the quinacridone gold. You get a gorgeous dark, mixing 3 primaries together using my size 6 brush, working damp into damp. It really brings those poppies to life, just working on these darks and details now on the rest of the flowers, the seed heads and the buds there, painting in some darker grasses, using a mixture of ultramarine, the quinacridone gold. Just these details here brings it to life. Remember, in watercolour, less is more, so try to leave some areas just a little bit underpainted. It keeps the painting really fresh and stops that muddying effect from the overworking. Sometimes it's difficult to see when you've finished, so I always say to my students, just walk away, come back maybe a day later to see if you need to do any more. You'll be a lot more objective. To finish off this painting, I thought I'd give a little spatter of some orange, some yellow and some red on the sort of horizon line and in and around the poppy field as well. So here's the finished painting. I've removed the washi tape to reveal a really nice white border, and I really hope this inspires you to have a go at painting something like this. For my 4th tutorial, I'm going to be painting these pretty lavenders in a field. Let's get started. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to mix up a pink wash. I'm using Winsor & Newton's Opera Rose. Just going to mix a wash here and just deepen that up. Add a bit more water. Add a bit of blue to that, ultramarine blue. Get that really, get a nice puddle of paint there, ready for my lavender fields. Next, I'm using some cerulean. Going to make some greens. Add a bit of yellow, a bit of water. Just really get that a nice big puddle. Next, I'm going to add a bit more Opera Rose. Starting with the pink first, and a touch of cerulean. Don't do what I do, dipping your brush in. Always rinse your brush. Bad habits die hard. I'm wetting my paper now, making sure I really get that water really sort of soaking into the paper, so it gives me more time to do the wet and wet washes. Next, I'm going to apply the sort of lavender pinky sort of colour for the background. Really sort of load your brush. I'm using an inch brush here, inch sable, really sort of putting it around the edges, wet on wet. Always keep loading your brush all the time, so don't sort of drag the paint too far. Now I'm putting the sort of more of a bluey sort of violet colour in, just as a contrast to the sort of pinky lavender sort of colour. Again, just sort of putting it in, wet on wet, easily, not overdoing things, sort of taking your time, letting the paint do the talking, as it were. Next, I'm going to apply the sort of limey green, lots of yellow and the cerulean, wet in wet, sort of putting it in the area where I've left a bit of white, just tilted it there just to get the colours blending. Now the colours are fully blending, I'm going to start putting some sort of, still wet in wet, but some leaf sort of markings. They're going to blend in, so you won't really see them, but you know, just to create a bit of texture, just making the paint a little bit thicker now, using the same colours, the cerulean and the yellow, and just putting those in. You'll see that they are sort of, they're not blending in as much now because the paint's thicker. I do work quite quickly. You don't have to work as quick as this. It's just my sort of method. But yeah, using the brush and just flicking the paint on like that to show the sort of grasses in the lavender field. Just rinsing my brush here now, wiping the excess off, adding a little bit of ultramarine now, a bit more pink, sort of quite thickish paint, not too much water. And I'm just putting in sort of, these are going to be like the lavender in the background. It's going to fade, so it looks kind of like the lavender sort of blurry in the background. So when I put my lavender wet on dry, that will come forward and look a bit more 3D. Just be careful when you put it in the green, it doesn't get too muddy. So I'm just putting a few more in here, just to create that impression of background lavender. A little bit in the foreground. Giving my brush a little rinse here. Now I'm about to sprinkle a little bit of sea salt on my lavender, background lavender, to create a little bit of texture. The salt sort of absorbs the paint and creates a lighter area, and it looks quite fun when the painting is dry. It's something you can do in sort of creating texture in hedgerows and things like that, and flower beds. I quite like doing. Different sort of salts creates different sort of effects, so you can try out different ways of using the salt. You can see now what amazing effect the salt has done now it's dry. Just painting in some of the stems now for the lavender, mixing up a bit of cerulean with a bit of pink, the Opera Rose, and just painting the little buds of the lavender now. And I'm just going to take my time and try and get the detail, and you can see immediately how that comes away from the background. So painting wet on dry, you get this sort of much more clearer defined edges, whereas you can see in the background with the wet on wet it's very fuzzy and out of focus. And that's one of the real differences when you paint with watercolour. You've got those wet on wet techniques and the wet on dry, which makes it quite, you know, sort of great when you're trying to create depth. You can create that 3D depth by using these two different techniques, which is great. I love it. I'll try and use it all the time. I love painting wet on wet. So just continuing using the Ultramarine and Opera Rose to create a little bit more darks now in the detail of the lavender. I'm just moving down the stem here, just putting in a little bit more detail. I'm just using the tip of my brush, sort of pressing hard and getting sort of different sort of pressures on the brush to create different sort of effects. And as the paint is drying, just adding a little bit more dark. So as you can see, I've got a few more on the go now, and I'm just adding little bits of dark. It's a tiny bit of damp into damp here, so it's not spreading too far. Paint's drying quite quickly today as well, so don't need to get the hairdryer out. But yeah, just building up slowly. As you can see, I haven't got any drawing here, so I'm just literally painting how I feel, you know, where I want to put another lavender bud. And I'm just putting in some stems now with the ultramarine and a bit of yellow with a very sort of small detailing brush. This brush actually that I'm using is a Winsor & Newton pointed sable, size 3, and it's lovely. It really has a beautiful point. I feel quite confident when I'm using it, so I definitely recommend that. They're not too expensive. Once they get larger, though, they become a lot more expensive. So just finishing off the finer bits of detail, softening those edges, sort of so they just disappear into the background. I'm just painting now some of those fuzzy lavender that I had earlier, wet in wet, just kind of giving them a tiny bit of detail as they come forward a little, just some of them. So I'm putting the paint on, then sort of diluting the paint a little bit just to push it back into the background. All these little sort of finessing and just trying to get it looking sort of like a lavender field, you know, sort of close up. Putting a little bit of detail on the bottom of the stem, sort of pale, just paler, sort of almost greyish colours. Just feeling my way, and I'll put some more just above here, just very, you know, see, very pale, so it kind of goes into the background. You can sort of see it, just pushing it into the background, sort of giving that painting a little bit of depth as we go. I'm just continuing here now, just adding little bits of detail. Sometimes it's just done by instinct rather than copying the picture. You just sort of feel it as you go, just sort of putting dots of darks, changing little bits of colour here and there. I just wanted to say actually, the little paint box I'm using there is the Winsor & Newton Field Box. And if you look on my YouTube channel, I've done a little review on it, and it's so lovely, and it's great if you are sort of out painting outdoors or on holiday. So yeah, have a look at my review and see what you think. So I'm just mixing up a little bit more of this lavender colour, the pink and the blue, and really fully loading my brush and giving it a good old spatter. It creates texture, sometimes stops me from painting as well and start getting too fiddly. But it's one of the things, it's sort of characteristics of my style of painting. What I'm doing now is I'm just putting some grasses in, just a little bit of detail in the foreground with a bit of ultramarine and a touch of yellow, just with my size 6 sable brush, and just sort of nice long free brush strokes, you know, just putting it through in the foreground, adding a bit of yellow ochre here, and just giving that a little bit of a contrasting colour, and you know, adding a bit of extra interest as we go. Just getting towards the end of the painting now. I'm just putting a few little dark leaves in there just as a bit of contrast, and bringing those sort of leaves and foliage a bit forward in the painting. So mixing a bit of the ultramarine and the yellow ochre, just a few sort of marks, really sort of free up the wrist and flick the paint on. Gives that nice natural sort of look as you go. Yeah, I think I've finished. I'm just taking off the masking tape and it gives a nice white sort of border. Always makes the paintings look nice if you haven't actually put a mount on it. It finishes off quite nicely. So I really hope you enjoyed this quick tutorial and that inspires you to paint something loose and similar. And for my 5th tutorial, I'm going to be painting these gorgeous dandelions using lifting off techniques and white gouache as an alternative to masking fluid. Let's get started. So I'm starting off here. I'm only using 3 colours plus white. I'm using ultramarine, cadmium yellow and quinacridone gold. If you don't have quinacridone gold, you could use yellow ochre or raw sienna. Using Winsor & Newton's white gouache, but you could use white watercolour paint. Arches rough paper, 300 grams, and it measures 9 by 12 inches. I started off painting the trees with a size 4 round brush and using the yellow, and now I'm mixing the yellow with a tiny touch of ultramarine with a large round brush, and I'm painting wet on dry the distant trees. You get some lovely texture when you paint wet on dry, especially with rough paper. Always keep loading your brush and then painting. Don't let the brush run out of paint, as it were. I've actually just mixed a little bit of quinacridone gold now to that colour, and it creates a lovely warm colour. I'm dropping it into that yellowy wash above. So it's just nice, just getting myself warmed up now, sort of almost just scrubbing the paint on, mixing up a little bit now of the quinacridone gold and the ultramarine to create a slightly darker, muddier shade. I mean, just using these 3 colours, you can actually get quite a lot of different shades. I've mixed up now the ultramarine with the yellow, and if you can see, the wash is now quite creamy because I don't want it to run too much, and this is made of quite a darker green, and I'm painting this damp into damp, so the paint's actually getting a little bit thicker now. And as you can see, I'm doing one of my favorite techniques, rolling the brush between my fingertips, and you get some lovely textures on the painting, and it's fun to do. So I'm just now painting, getting that thicker creamy paint and just painting the horizon now. And this part of the painting is very, obviously the paper is quite dry, so it's wet on dry. Mixing up a really dark, thick, creamy paint, getting plenty of paint, and I want to put this really thick, dark, creamy wash damp into damp. That's the paper is damp, my brush is damp, so it's not too wet, and I'm putting these colours thick and creamy onto the surface of the paper. Just when you thought I couldn't get any darker, I've gone darker still. I've added loads of ultramarine with a tiny touch of the quinacridone gold to put this very, very dark colour on. I'm going to use just an ordinary plastic card cut up, and now I'm just literally, now the paint's quite damp, it's not dry. I don't want to do this when it's dry. I'm just pulling off the paint. I'm scratching into the paper and pulling off the paint, and it reveals these kind of lovely light coloured trunks and branches, and it's such a cool technique. I love doing this. So you must make sure the paint's quite creamy. If it's too wet, it's all just going to run back in. So this way it just lifts off beautifully. What I'm doing now is just trying to make some of the trunks a little bit wider, just scratching into them. It's just a real feel-good factor, this. It's very, very sort of inspiring. I would suggest doing this on a piece of rough paper before you do it in your painting, just to get the timings right. You want the thickness to be correct. Otherwise, you're going to get very frustrated. And there's a lot more pressure when you are painting the painting for real. So if you have a little practice first, it'll make all the difference. You can see here, I'm using a little spritzer bottle, and I'm just spraying the horizon, the bottom of the trees, just the start of my dandelion field. So I've set the backdrop, haven't actually painted a sky as yet, that will come later. I'm now putting this lovely cadmium yellow all over my foreground, wet on wet. So I've wet the paper first, so it all goes on really nice and easily. Now I'm using a new brush. I've only just bought this brush from Jackson's Art Supplies. It's by Silver Brush. It's their black velvet brush, size 12. I've read really, really good reviews about it, and I'm just going to say I absolutely love it. It is early days, but it carries loads of paint. It's got a beautiful point, and it's fun to use. Now putting on the Quinacridone Gold, sort of in patches. So you've got these little areas. I'm kind of setting the backdrop for these dandelions. So I want to create some lovely background for them, lots of textures. So this is my starting point. So I'm now mixing up a little bit of the yellow with the ultramarine. You can see the paint's quite creamy. I don't want it too wet because it's all going to run all over the place. It's just putting in some marks for leaves and stems, and it's all damp into damp now, and it's quite a joy to use. Just 3 colors, keeping everything really simple. I've just added a touch more yellow, just really making up more paint really, and just painting this on, just, you know. And when you go into the distance, try to make the marks smaller, and when you come into the foreground, make the marks bigger, because that way it creates a little bit of depth in your painting. So I'm using a very similar technique to what I did in the background trees. My paint's getting thicker. You kind of want to, when you're working in watercolour, you want to work thin to thick. So the paint's getting thicker so it stays put. So it gives you soft edges and kind of gives you the impression of leaves and stems, etc. Lots of lovely, yummy foliage. So I'm going a little bit darker now, adding a little bit more ultramarine and just using more the tip of my brush. I'm sort of popping in darks here and there, damp into damp. As you saw there, I've actually used Quinacridone Gold literally straight from the tube onto this painting. Don't forget to protect your sky with some kitchen towel before you start to spatter. Now I'm using some yellow, watered down yellow now, and just spattering this onto the surface of the paper, and the Quinacridone Gold the same, just spattering it on to make lots of little marks. Sometimes it's very hard to do random marks, so I'm now just watered down all my washes and I'm just spattering it so I create that random mark effect. I'm just putting a few darker grasses just in the foreground, a few more little dark marks here and there with my small round size 4 brush. I'm going to sprinkle some sea salt on here, but table salt will do fine, and just leave that to dry, and it does turn out some beautiful textures. Once your salt's dry, brush it off with your kitchen towel. Once the salt's all off, I'm actually now taking off paint. I'm lifting it off, and I'm using a stencil brush for this. Any bristly brush will work, but a stencil brush will give you some nice circles. If you don't have a stencil brush or a bristle brush, try a Q-tip or something of that sort of nature to lift off the paint. So you keep cleaning your brush each time, wiping it on a tissue and then scrubbing again. So as you can see, I'm going round and round in circles, working that paint off the paper and then getting my kitchen towel and lifting off that paint. The reason for my choice of colours is because they're non-staining colours. So it's a lot easier to lift off the paint. So when you're scrubbing away, be careful you don't scrub too much that you create a hole in the paper. It does rough the paper up a bit. That's why you should use 300-gram paper. As you can see there now, I'm using my size 4 round brush and I'm painting the dandelions with white gouache paint, and I'm painting this wet on dry, and I've added a little bit of water to the paint. Don't add too much of the white because it becomes too transparent. We need the white paint to cover what we've lifted off, because obviously we've got these ghost-like yellow circles. So I'm actually painting some of the little seed heads here just with pure white paint. It looks quite good against the dark background as well, so I'm just putting them here and there, and it creates a little bit more texture. The other thing I'm doing now is I'm building up another layer of white paint onto the dandelions. As you can see from the other ones, they've faded back a bit, so it's important to build up these white layers of paint. So I put a little bit of white in the limey green, that's the yellow and the blue, and I'm just painting the stems of these little seed heads now. Again, it just adds interest and detail and texture to the background of this dandelion field. This is wet on dry, and I'm using this size 4 pointed round brush, which really is beautiful. It gives me such a lovely, lovely point. Look at that, just the ease and the grace of the way those stems come down. Just loving it. So just continue on putting these little seed heads in, painting all the little bits of detail in. You can put as many as you like in, because as you can see from the reference photo, there's so much detail. Such a lovely painting to do. Now I'm painting the centres here. I'm just using ultramarine with a tiny touch of yellow, using this size 4 round brush, just giving some detail. Now you can see how it's popping these dandelions out. Now it's starting to come to life, this painting. So we're heading towards that business end of the painting, the darks and the details, you know, just that sort of thing that brings the whole painting to life. I've just mixed up a very watery ultramarine with a touch of yellow to create some shadowy colours in my dandelions. Just, this is quite a watered down wash, so don't be afraid, it's not too dark and scary. So I'm painting these shadowy colours at the bottom and to the left of each dandelion. So I want the light to be consistent, coming from the right and above. Going around painting each dandelion, giving each one a little bit of attention. What I am doing here is a little bit of a splodgy mark in the background there. So I've scrubbed it off with that stencil brush and wiped it off with a tissue. And now I'm painting with just some ultramarine, a cloudy sort of sky. But I didn't really like it that much. I thought it was a bit too attention seeking. So I actually sprayed it and then softened it, and I was more pleased with that result. So don't be afraid to wipe off or spray off your mistakes if you don't like them. If you've painted something, you don't like it, remove it. But do try to do this gently because you don't want to disturb the painting underneath. So as you can see, I'm building up some more lights. I put my shadows on. I just want a little bit more light. I'm using just the white gouache with a touch of water. And I'm giving the dandelions that are the main dandelions the most sort of attention. And the ones that are sort of in the middle distance, a little bit less attention. And those ones much further back, or the ones that I just want to receive back, I'm giving hardly any attention at all. You take a look at the reference photo. My painting is similar, but it's different. It's an interpretation, but it's given me an opportunity to use all these different techniques and to show you and to inspire you to hopefully paint along as well. So this will make you laugh. These are all my little extras, and I'm spattering some white paint on for the background here, and it just creates that look of dandelions in the distance. It's a really effective technique. And what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some limey green and I'm putting some grasses in the foreground. I mean, sometimes when you put a little bit too much dark on, you can use this limey green with a tiny touch of white to sort of cover a few sins. So I'm back with my plastic card and I'm using a dark green, and I'm just printing with this to create some lovely thin stems. This is just a finish off my painting now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've learned something from all the different techniques I use to paint the dandelions, and of course all the alternatives to masking fluid. I always use a mount board just to see if I need to do any more work, but I think I'll leave it there for now. For my 6th and final tutorial, I'm going to paint these gorgeous daisies using just 2 colours and using a fabulous bokeh technique in the background. Let's get started. Drew the outline for the daisies with an HB pencil onto this smooth watercolour surface, and now I'm applying blue masking fluid with an old brush, and I'm just painting on the whole of the daisies, including the centre, so I can really freely sort of paint my background wet in wet later. Once your painting is dried, you can decide on the colours. I'm using Payne's Grey and Permanent Yellow. I'm using a magic sponge and a natural sponge, but you could even use your stencil brush or a Q-tip. This is my circle stencil, which I did buy from Amazon. I'm just going to mix up some colours now for the background. So I've got yellow, I've got sort of a mid to dark green, and then a very dark green. And I'm wetting the paper now with clean water with my size 14 round black velvet brush, really giving the paper a good soak before I apply my yellow paint, which I'm doing here wet in wet, quite random. So don't worry about where you're going to place it. Have fun with it. And now I'm applying that sort of mid-green colour, and of course it's going to mix a little bit as well with the yellow, so that's absolutely fine. So you can just push the colour around wet in wet. I'm actually just making a little bit more colour there, so it's a mid to dark green. Really fully load your brush and apply this paint wet into wet and let it all sort of merge in to create a really nice soft atmospheric effect, you know, using wet in wet techniques. As you saw there, I added a little bit more of the phthalo turquoise just to make a really bit stronger green there. And I thought I might paint some little circles as well, just to try things out. This technique is so new to me. I'm really enjoying it. But as you can see here, I'm continuing on painting darks on top of the daisies now, because when it's all dry and I take off the masking fluid, you've got a lovely contrast of dark and light with the petals really coming forward. It's time to allow your painting to dry before you start lifting off to create the bokeh effect. So I'm using the magic sponge. It's a sponge that you can buy from an art supplier, but also you can get it from DIY stores, hardware stores, because it actually gets marks off painted walls as well in the house. I'm actually lifting off with clean water using the stencil and the magic sponge to lift off the paint, because watercolour isn't permanent. So I've actually swapped now to a natural sponge just to show you can use that as well. And another tip is to get a wide bowl of water. I don't know if you noticed there, but I did swap from my little trio pot to a larger bowl because it was very difficult to keep putting my sponge in and out of that little trio pot. Wipe off, lift off with the sponge. Do dab with your paper towel afterwards so you haven't got any residue liquid. A really good tip is to vary the size of your circles. That really works well. It looks so effective. And once you've finished lifting off your circles, allow your painting to dry again. So I'm lifting off using the paper towel. So once you remove the masking fluid, start painting wet on dry, some yellow in the center there. So I'm painting it quite creamy to the left there, and to the right hand side there's more light on that center. So I'm going to dilute my paint with some clean water, as you see I'm doing there. Take that excess off and then just soften here with the clean water. So you still pick up the yellow, but it'll be a lighter wash, so it looks like the light's hitting that sort of right hand side. So I'm painting the stems in wet on dry using a mixture of the yellow, you could use a touch of the blue, and the Payne's grey here, just varying the sort of tonal values, having it a little bit darker here and there and then a bit lighter at the bottom. Take your time with stems. These aren't too tricky because they're a bit wider, they're not too thin, so you can just sort of fill in a little bit more. And again, I'm just varying the colours using this size 6, working wet on dry to begin with, but then you can drop in other colours wet into wet as well. I've allowed my painting to dry naturally, and I'm working wet on dry now using my size 6 brush with some of the green just around the edge here to the left to create some shadows, and it looks quite effective and makes it look a little bit 3D. So I'm just working on this daisy to the left here, adding a little bit of water to that dark wash there, and it travelled a little bit too much, so I've just got my paper towel on standby here just to soften that dark, and I'm going to allow my painting to dry. So I've gone back in again with my stencil, which you can do, you know, maybe that first part you might want to do a few and then decide if you want to add some more. But the other reason why I'm doing this, because I'm actually using some of that bokeh effect over the top of some of the stems as well, which I thought would be quite effective. So I'm just lifting off as well with the paper towel to get rid of any of the excess fluid there, working damp into damp to add a little bit more dark green, Payne's grey and yellow, just to build up that tonal value there to create some depth in the centre of the daisies, and also some texture as well. As you can see there, I'm stippling a little bit with the tip of my size 6 brush to create some texture there. I'm doing so as well on the left hand side here, damp into damp, so it's creamy dark colour, so it doesn't run too much, so you've got a soft edge but it stays put and it doesn't move too much. So I'm going to allow my painting to dry again, and I'm next going to paint some shadows on the petals, but not very much. I don't want my painting to look like grey daisies, so you've always got to leave a lot more white than you are comfortable with. Almost, you've got to exaggerate it. So I'm mixing up a very, very dilute turquoise with a touch of the Payne's grey and just painting this very thin light wash onto the surface of the daisy petals here and there, working wet on dry, but then you can soften and blend as well with some clean water, which is what I'm doing now as well. So remember, this is a very, very dilute wash. There aren't a lot of shadows on those daisies, so really paint the minimum that you can and leave lots of white. I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. I wanted to bring those sort of daisies forward a bit more, so I'm adding some red, cadmium red, permanent yellow. Just use a red and a yellow, more yellow than red, and I'm just sort of painting in a little bit of this warm colour, stippling it into the surface there, wet on dry, just to give a little bit more detail but warmth as well, there, using my size 6 brush to finish off my painting. And I think I will leave it there for now. I'm just going to remove the washi tape. It does reveal a lovely white border, and it gives you time to assess to see if you need to do any more work to your painting. It gives you a much more of an objective point of view, and it also presents your work really well. So here's the finished painting. I'm really pleased with it. I love that bokeh effect. It's so effective, and I really love daisies. And I hope you love them too, and that you're inspired to have a go at the daisy pictures, one of the others, or all of them. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you would like to watch the extended versions of these tutorials with lots more voiceovers, with downloadable outline sketches, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? You will also get access to my exclusive tutorials. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.